Well, good morning. How are we today?
Good morning.
Oh man, the energy. I just love the energy. That's amazing. 30 degrees makes a world of difference, doesn't it, compared to last week and the week before. Hey, so my mom was a school nurse, and back in the day, one time she had a student come into her, and she asked the kid what was wrong, and the kid said, "I'm feeling swimmy-headed." I'm feeling swimmy-headed. And we've gotten a good laugh out of that over the years, but I'm just sharing that to say, I feel a little swimmy-headed today, okay? So if things don't make a whole lot of sense, I'm going to do the best I can. I may pull my notes out a little bit more than I normally do because I want to make sure that what we talk about today makes all kinds of sense because this is so important. I was even just praying over there. God, I hope I do justice to this message because it really is an important one. Okay, so we're going to start off today with a question. Here it is. How do you know God is pleased with you? How do you know if God's pleased with you? It's kind of an interesting question, right? How's that to start? And it's probably something that you've thought about before. I think it's something that we've all thought about before at some point in time. And we can come up with all kinds of answers for that. One is happiness. Like if I'm happy, if things are going well in my life, like God wants me to be happy, right? So he must be pleased with me if I'm happy. Or maybe I'm at peace. I'm at peace in my life. I'm at peace in my circumstances. There's a peace that surpasses understanding. So I'm at peace. God must be, happy with me. God's pleased with me if I'm at peace. Or other people approve of me, and that's a good thing. If they're approving of who I am, then somehow God must be happy with that. Or I'm successful. I've achieved the career. Like he's rewarding me with these good things. He's rewarding me with a good wife or a good husband or whatever. Sometimes we think about karma. The idea that what goes around comes around, and so if I'm getting good things, it's because I've done good things, or if I'm getting bad things, it's because I've done bad things. And so if God's happy with me, if I've been doing good things, then God's going to give me good things back. So what is it for you? How do you know if God is pleased with you? You might be surprised to find out that none of those is actually the correct answer. And we're going to talk about that today in part 4 of our series, Soul Quest. Soul Quest. We've been talking about how we're all searching for something. We're all looking for meaning. We're all looking for purpose, for a sense of belonging. We're looking for peace. We're looking for love. And so we go after relationships, right? We go after having a successful career and climbing the ladder. We go after having kids and letting our kids have every opportunity that we wish we could have had. We go after, money and resources and finding a group that supports us. We go after having, the perfect body and working out and doing all kinds of stuff. I mean, we're pursuing all kinds of things, looking for purpose and meaning. But what we've been saying throughout this series is all of those things eventually leave us empty. And we discover this thing in our lives where we say, isn't there more than this? Like, surely there's more to life than this. We've been, at this point, Augustine's words come into play. Augustine, this famous Christian who said, "You've made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." We've been hanging our series kind of on this quote from Augustine. The idea that as we look for purpose and meaning and on all those other things, we move away from God. And it's when we move away from God that we find ourselves restless, that we haven't found what it is that we're looking for. And so the invitation then is to come back, to return to him, to find our purpose and meaning in what he has for us. And so if you missed any of the messages in this series, I would encourage you to go back and listen. They do build on each other and bring us to where we are today. And we're going to talk about today something that's going to debunk a misunderstanding that often we have about God and people in our culture have about God. In fact, it's something that's really only been taught in the last couple hundred years in churches. It wasn't taught before then. And for whatever reason, we've kind of got this idea in our mind of what God is like and how we know if he's pleased with us. But that's not really reality as evidenced throughout the Bible. And I'm confident that even though this may confront something in you that you didn't even know you believed, if you read through the pages of Scripture, I think you'll come to the same conclusion. It'll point us to our true north of how do we know if God is pleased with us. It goes back to that question. How do you know, again, if God is pleased with you? Because the general understanding we have is that God being pleased with us is indicated by the circumstances around us. Or as Christians on social media like to say, #blessed, right? You know what I'm talking about. I'm blessed. I'm just blessed. My relationships, they're great. I'm blessed financially. I'm blessed in my job. I'm blessed in my relationship. Everything's just, it's so wonderful. And we often think that we have this kind of agreement with God that if I do this, then God must do that. Like God's obligated to bless me if I'm doing all the right things. Years ago, I was at a church down in South Carolina. It was kind of this big mega church, and there was a guest pastor who was speaking, and he was talking about money, and particularly how much money he's given away and how God has financially blessed him. Like he's like, oh, you can't outgive God, and I just give more, and God gives me more. And the message was like, God's obligated to give more financially to me as I give financially to him. And that's a nice idea. It's just not founded. God never made that promise. This idea that if I do this, then God must do that, it's actually based on an agreement that God had with the nation of Israel, not with us as individuals today. It's not founded in the New Testament, it's founded in the Old Testament. If you've got a Bible, it's divided into two sections. There's an Old Testament, which is the days before Jesus, and the New Testament, that's the time of Jesus onward. And a better maybe translation of the word testament would be covenant or agreement. And the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, chronicles, actually there are several agreements God had with different people, and we're going to talk about those actually in a few weeks, so you don't want to miss that. But particularly there's one covenant that God had with the people of Israel. And in that arrangement, it was completely, if I do, God must. Or maybe more accurately, it would be, if we do, God will. And so back in the day, as God made this agreement with the people of Israel, it's like, if you remain faithful to me, then I will bless you. And so their prosperity as a nation was tied to their faithfulness to God. They knew where they were in their relationship with God. They knew if they were pleasing God based on how things were in their world around them, their physical world around them. Which is why, as they had leaders that led them away from God, God ended up sending them into slavery or into exile by the Assyrians in 722 BC, by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And the whole purpose of that was to bring them back, right? If I do, God must. If we do, God will. God will bless us if we're doing the right things. But here's the thing that we often miss and we forget. We are not Israel. Instead, Jesus initiated a new agreement with us, his people. And it's not based on our behavior. It's actually based on his behavior and what he did. And this covenant, it was made at the Last Supper when Jesus was sitting around with his disciples when they gathered on that one side of the table for the picture, And Jesus' days, they were numbered, so he wasn't buying green bananas anymore. I mean, he knew that this was all coming to an end. And he sat down with them and he broke bread. He said, this is my body that's being broken for you. And then he took a cup of wine. He said, this represents my blood. In fact, here's what he said. He said, this cup is the new covenant. This is the new agreement in my blood, which is poured out for you. This agreement is not based on your behavior, he would say. This agreement is based on Jesus' behavior. It's based on him being the perfect that you and I could never be. And so our standing with God is not based on our circumstances. Our standing with God isn't evidenced by our circumstances. It's based on a single event that took place out of the walls of Jerusalem on a Roman cross 2,000 years ago. And the problem with believing that good circumstances are an indication of God's pleasure with us is that Christianity is based on the worst possible thing happening to the best possible person. Jesus was the best possible person. Even if you don't believe he's the Son of God, you would agree that he was a good person. Even Jewish people, the Muslim people, everybody thinks, oh yeah, Jesus was this great guy. So if God's blessing is indicated by good things happening, then you would logically say, well, clearly God wasn't blessing Jesus because he was crucified. But we know that's not true. God was clearly blessing him. See, don't miss this. Old covenant promises are not ours. But here's the good news. Our promises are better. Like we have something so much better than what the people of Israel had. because their promises, they were temporary. It was like good land. It was like having lots of children and good health. And those are all great things, but they're just temporary. But the promises made for us in the New Testament, the new covenant that we have, they're eternal promises. They're good things. It's hope for life and for fellowship with God and eternity. That's kind of what we were singing about here just a couple of minutes ago. So the author of a book called Hebrews, or a letter that was written to these Jewish men and women who became followers of Jesus, the author of Hebrews said this. He said, "For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, a new agreement, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance." Not something that's temporary, not the hashtag blessed life here, but an eternal hope. Like looking down the road, looking down, saying one day God has something amazing for us. So that still leaves us with the question, though, how do we know God's pleased with us, right? How do we know if God's pleased with us? Well, the answer is actually far simpler than what you'd expect, and it predated that agreement that God had with the nation of Israel. And it comes down to faith. Faith. The author of Hebrews, he defined faith like this. He says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Here's maybe a definition that we could kind of summarize this. Faith is confidence that the invisible God will do what he's promised. That's our assurance about what we don't see, that God has made this promise of eternity, and we believe with confidence that he's going to ultimately fulfill it. The key word there is confidence, that God is trustworthy. Faith is the thing that gives us spiritual eyes to see what God is doing in spite of the fact that our physical circumstances may not necessarily indicate that God is blessing us. Faith is the thing that allows us to say God may be at work even if it doesn't feel like God is at work right now, which can be a little bit unsettling, right? Especially if, you've gone through a difficult thing in life and people have said, well, just believe, right? Just believe. And you believed and you had faith and you weren't hashtag blessed. Like you looked at your life and you're thinking, why is my life cursed when everyone else's is blessed? Why are things going bad for me when everyone else, it's like things are working out for them? Why do the bad situations happen to me? That's a legitimate question, and we ask it because in our minds, we have the same agreement with God that the nation of Israel had with God, but we don't. Before Israel, there was an agreement that was based on faith. The author of Hebrews says this is what the ancients were commended for. The people of old, the long, long, long ago people, faith is what they were commended for. The way, way, way back people, even long before Abraham. Back in the day of Adam and Eve, they had two kids, Cain and Abel. You know why Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, right? Because they raised Cain. Bad, I know, bad. Okay, so they had two sons. Abel had faith, Cain didn't, and God commended Abel for his faith. Then there's a guy, Enoch. Hebrews 11 records Enoch's life, and Enoch's faith was so amazing. He actually was just like translated up into heaven. He didn't ever die. Pretty remarkable. And so the author of Hebrews kind of comes to this conclusion, talking about all these people of faith. He says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. But God is pleased when we display our confidence in him in spite of our circumstances, in spite of the fact that we can't necessarily see him working. If we don't trust in God, then we can't have faith. And if we don't have faith, we're not going to obey him. Now, we're not the first people to wrestle with all of this because this is a little bit out there, right? I'll admit that. And for centuries, people have struggled to understand. Many, though, were able to trust God even when it didn't make sense. And God was pleased with them. In fact, here's what the text says. Without faith, it's impossible to please God because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. It's like, okay, he rewards them, so what does he reward them with? Himself. He rewards them with himself, with his presence, which I get that. And we're kind of like, isn't there a different reward? Like, that's not like the greatest selling point maybe for you, depending on where you are. You're thinking, that's great. Why don't you reward me with yourself and stuff, and good circumstances? And I get that. But the point is that those things are all temporary. Those things are all temporary. The good things in life don't last. And so the author of Hebrews goes through this litany of people who have had remarkable, just incredible faith. He chronicles the lives of people like Abraham. Remember Abraham, Father Abraham? Father Abraham had many sons had Father Abraham. Nobody else knows that song. Okay, that was only me. Okay, I grew up in church, we sang that at Vacation Bible School, but Father Abraham, he had all these sons, except he didn't, right? And the remarkable thing about Abraham is he met a God he'd never met who invited him to go to a land where he'd never been, and he made this incredible promise that if you go and do what I'm telling you to do, I'll make you into a great nation. And Abraham believed him in spite of the fact that Abraham had 0 children. And his wife was like a dinosaur, and she was unable to have children. It's kind of comical what the author of Hebrews says. He says, and so from this one man, and he as good as dead, right? Sudden death is not far off. That's how old this guy was. Came descendants as numerous as stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Like Abraham remarkably had this son Isaac and from Isaac came a nation of people, the people of Israel. He goes on, he says, all these people, Abraham's wife, Sarah, and others, all these were living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. When Abraham died, he didn't have a nation of people. He had a son. He simply believed. And God said he would bless the whole world, but the whole world hadn't been blessed yet. That wouldn't come for 2,000 years after Abraham when Jesus was born. See, from Abraham came Israel, came the Messiah, came our hope. And Abraham and others, they demonstrated something very important, that it is possible to live a life of faith even if God's presence and blessing seem absent, which is kind of hard to comprehend, right? Because we see others getting the things that we think we should get. And we want immediate answers to our prayers. God heal us. God help me find my keys. God help me get the job. Help me to pass this test. Help me to find a date on Friday night. Help me to win the Powerball. Or this is my last $5 I got to scratch off. Let me win this one. We want God to show up in all those different things. Abraham and Sarah waited 25 years. Think about that. They waited 25 years from the time God promised them they would have a child and they were already old. 25 years, trusting that God would do what he had promised. And even then, they only saw things partially. The author of Hebrews says they didn't receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on this earth. See, they looked down the road. They recognized that the earth was not their permanent home. And they knew that their time here was temporary. He says this, he says, instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. They weren't concerned about the circumstances around them. They were willing to endure what was temporary, believing that there was something good for them in eternity. Faith is confidence in our heavenly home. And that's the kind of faith that pleases God. Now, let me just ask you a question. Does your life reflect that kind of confidence that you're just passing through, that the circumstances that you go through, are just temporary, and that they're not going to disrupt your confidence in God? Or how about this? How would you prepare now if you knew you were destined for a different place? What would your life look like now if you knew you were only here temporarily? Years ago, Carrie and I felt called by God to move to Brazil. And so we lived there for about a year. And I'll never forget the last month or so before we left. There were some things we were not doing during that time. We weren't going new car shopping, right? We weren't buying furniture. We were trying to make the best use of the time we had, knowing that our time was limited, that we were preparing to go somewhere else. We were mentally preparing, we were emotionally preparing, we were relationally preparing. How does your life reflect what you're prepared to do, where you're headed? When we focus our life on this world and on our current circumstances, that doesn't lead us to a faith that's pleasing to God. See, here's the point, that God is pleased when we live faithfully, even when we don't know the outcome. We're not concerned about here. We're focused on there. And when we can learn to live that way, we discover a trustworthy God who says, yes, you can lean on me. Yes, you can rely on me. The author of Hebrews, he goes through this whole litany of people from Abraham all the way up to Jesus. And it's such a beautiful list. As I said earlier, I think, go back, read Hebrews chapter 11, because it is just inspiring. Here's what he says. He says, I don't even have time to tell you about all the people, Gideon and Barak, Samson and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions and quenched the fury of flames and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Like as you read through the pages of the Old Testament, what you discover is there were people who had kind of a larger than life faith and confidence in God. And he says, be inspired by these examples of men and women who didn't give up even though life was difficult. But then he goes on and says, you need to know though, faith isn't magic. Like it's not going to suddenly make everything perfect in your life. It doesn't always result in things ending with a nice tiny bow at the end of it. Because he goes on and he says this, he says, there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. Because not every faithful person gets to slay a giant. Not every faithful person survives the furnace. Not every faithful person has their ailment healed. But that doesn't stop people from living confidently in God. And some people might look at this list and say they were fools for what they believed. But you know what the author of Hebrews says? He says the world was not worthy of their presence. Like these men and women were so remarkable. They didn't even deserve to share the earth with the others who were responsible for committing those atrocities against them. And what made their lives so extraordinary was their larger than life confidence, trust, assurance that God is who he says he is, and he'll do all he's promised to do, that his promises are good and true. He says this, he says, these were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us. Wow. You know the better he had planned for us? It's Jesus. Jesus, the hope that we have. They didn't get to see it. They simply lived with faith in the direction of the future. And now we live reaping the benefits of their incredible faith. These men and women who stayed close to God in spite of life circumstances. They looked forward with courage, while so many of us look back in fear and doubt and overwhelmed by life. And we forget the heavenly home that we're invited to. So the author of Hebrews, he challenges us. Here's what he says. He says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, all these men and women of faith who have gone before us, he says, don't be distracted by your temporary discomfort. Think about all these men and women who had a persevering, enduring faith. And let's remind ourselves of them. He goes on, he says, and let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. He says that if there's anything that's keeping you from living a life confident in God, just abandon it. If there's anything that's distracting you, because there is something greater at stake than momentary pleasure or comfort on this planet. There's something far greater. He says, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Now, the word perseverance, it means pressing on. It means not giving up, not giving in, not shutting down. And I love this term because the reality is we are all running a race. And it could be for you right now, you're on like the downhill portion of the race. I used to run cross country, and there was this one awful course that was on a reservoir, and it had these, 10-foot, 20-foot high banks. And you just like ran up and down, right? And so when you would get to the top and you'd be on that downhill portion of the race, I mean, that's when you're like, yes, thank you. I'm so glad that it's easy, right? And it could be your life is like that right now. Things are good. Family's good. Marriage is good. Job's good. Finances are good. College is good. Future's good, right? Everything's good. Everything just feels good right now. And it's easy to abandon faith when things are good because we don't need God. We don't need his help. We've got it figured out. But now's not the time to give up. We got to persevere. We got to persevere in the race and say, okay, God, how do you want to use me now in the good times? How do you want to prepare me for the difficult times? Because here's the thing I know, that as soon as you're headed downhill and you're nice and comfortable going downhill, what happens? You slam into a wall. And suddenly you're going back uphill. And suddenly difficulty's facing you. And that could be where you are in the race right now. And you're going uphill and things aren't easy and marriage isn't easy and the kids aren't easy and maybe you got a prodigal one right now that you're figuring out and trying to deal with. And you're just asking, God, what in the world is going on here? He says, in the midst of all of that, in the midst of the difficulty, he says, fix your eyes on Jesus. Fix your eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Like, don't lose sight of why you're here and what you hope for and the hope that you have. That Jesus is the reason that we can have faith because he lived with the worst that humanity had to throw at him. And he endured it. And you may think to yourself, well, who holds on to God even when God doesn't seem to be holding on to them, even when God doesn't seem to be blessing them in circumstances? And you know the answer to that? Faithful people. Faithful people who say, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to endure. Fix your eyes on Jesus. He goes on, he says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. I mean, the most painful death imaginable, scorning its shame, because Roman citizens were exempt from crucifixions because they were so awful. But Jesus embraced it. He said, look, if this is what God has for me, I am willing to embrace the difficulties because I believe God has something good. Scorning its shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And he endured it for you. He endured it for me. And when you're in those uphill moments, he says this, he says, consider him who endured such opposition from sinners. Think long and hard about what happened to Jesus. Why? Here's why. He says, so that you will not grow weary and lose hope. Because sometimes in life we do grow weary. We do lose hope, don't we? When we lose sight of what matters and we get distracted and we get discouraged, he says, fix your eyes on Jesus, your true north. The one who set an example for you so that you can persevere. And so the way you know if God is pleased with you, it's simple. You just live each day as someone who confidently trusts in God's presence and in his promise of eternity. Even when you don't feel blessed, even when you don't see it. You run your race with perseverance, holding strong to him. Now, again, you could say, that seems crazy to me. But what's the other option? Spend your life angry at God and give him a fist, right? Or you can think of Jesus and throw off everything that hinders and the things that keep us from living faithfully. The things that we go to kind of numb our pain and numb the things that are going, the things we go to distract ourselves from what's going on in our lives. But you do that, and the thing is, you won't be alone in your pursuit. Because you know what? There are many people in this room, many that I've sat with, cried with, prayed with, who have gone through larger than life circumstances, who have gone through difficulty, who have endured, and who have been able to hold on to their faith. And so I just share that to say you're not alone. You're not alone. When life is difficult and you wonder where God is and can you confidently lean into him, you need to be reminded, yes, you can. There are men and women here who have continued running uphill races and they have been able to persevere. Whatever your race is, your job is to run it faithfully, to live faithfully. And I don't know why God gives some people the easy races and other people the difficult ones. I don't know why some people have wrinkle-free, easy lives and other people have just unbelievably difficult circumstances. But I do know that the way you live your life, the way you live out your faith will have an impact in someone someday. This is so important. The way you live out your faith leaves an impression on others, for better or for worse. That's why we can look at Hebrews 11 and see these men and women who had incredible faith. Listen, current and future generations of people will live and reap the benefits of the faith that you have. And that's why Hebrews inspires us to have something similar. We're inspired to keep enduring, to not give up, to not give in. So here's the last thing I want to invite you to think about, the question I want you to think about this week. And that is, who will reap the benefits of your faith? Who will reap the benefits of your faith? Who will your faith inspire? Who are the people who are one day going to look at your life and say, man, I can't believe she endured that. I can't believe he endured that. I can't believe they were able to hold on to God. Is there anyone? Is there anyone that would look to you and say, wow, they had a larger than life faith? You know, so often we're told to live lives for the sake of us and do everything that we want to do. But quite honestly, that's what leads us to a place of unhappiness. That's what leads us to a place of saying, why does it matter? And discouragement in our soul quest. But the people in Hebrews, they lived a life that inspired future generations, that inspired us all these years later. So are you taking steps to confidently proclaim your trust in God? Are you embracing the yoke that Jesus invited us to embrace that we talked about last week, setting our eyes on him? If the next generation has only your life to look to, what will they discover? Will they be inspired to hold on? Sometimes I think we have this mentality that we have to, work at a church to live an inspirational life or to be a faithful person. But the reality is, you guys are the ones who inspire me. I was thinking about the men and women over the years who have given financially, who have served faithfully, who have selflessly, given of their time and invested into the hearts of my kids and the hearts of people in our community who have served at Bread of Life, who have helped to create things like the Bread of Life and the food pantry in Batesville, and people whose faith just inspires generations. We are reaping the benefits of their faith. Who will reap the benefits of yours? Who will reap the benefits of yours? Even when life doesn't give us what we want, we can run with perseverance. So, live each day as someone who confidently trusts in God's presence and his promise of eternity. Cling to him, and you will please God. You will please God. And you will experience his presence. And we're going to pick it up there next week as we close out this series, Soul Quest. Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, the men and women who have gone before us, who have lived such inspiring lives of confidence in you, I am so thankful for them. Thankful for the people in this room who have lived such inspiring lives of faith. God, would that be true of each one of us? That we would confidently trust you, even if things in our world don't seem to go the way we think they should go. God, let us lean into you for our strength, for our hope, and let us place our faith in eternity. Thank you for what you've given us today, God. Give each one of us wisdom to know what we need to do with what we've heard, and give us the courage to do it. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.